Alrighty, welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about Small Gods by Terry Pratchett. And because this video is coming out on Christmas, I decided to make myself some hot cocoa to make it feel more like Christmas. Okay, so Small Gods is the story of Brother, a novice in the country of Omania, which is run by the Church of the Great God Om. Om is a god that demands obedience and the punishment of sinners and non-believers. Or at least that's what everyone assumes? Turns out, for the last 3 years, Om has actually been a tortoise. He planned to come down to Discworld to do something dramatic to remind his believers what they owed him, but somehow instead he found himself trapped in the shape of a tortoise. When he is dropped into the citadel of the Church of Om, he should be in the best place possible, surrounded by his believers, their belief powering him, feeding him power. But instead he finds only one person capable of hearing him. Brother, a slow, careful, obedient young man who remembers everything and is content to work in the garden for the rest of his life. But when Om speaks to him, Brother finds himself dragged into the complex politics of the church, its holy wars on the neighboring country, and the designs of Vorbis, a man who has already decided that the god will pick him as the next great prophet. So, I'm going to tell you a story that is only tangentially related to this book. In college, I was sitting in the dining hall reading a Terry Pratchett book. On the cover was a blurb. Not this blurb, by the way, which, apropos of nothing, I hate this blurb. It says, think J.R.R. Tolkien with a sharper, more satiric edge, which I think is stupid as hell, because frankly, no. Pratchett and Tolkien have nothing in common except for being surprisingly deep and writing stuff that's nominally fantasy. But the blurb on that cover said something about Pratchett being our generation's Mark Twain. And one of my friends, when he arrived, saw that, read the blurb, and I will admit this kid was a hair pretentious, but he really showed his ass that day because he looked at that blurb and said something to the extent of, "Oh, that's absurd to call some silly fantasy author the Twain of our generation. I'm so tired of people, like, attributing everyone who writes satire to being the next great Twain." And before I could even formulate my response, one of my other friends sitting at the table spoke up and was like, "Have you read Pratchett? Because he is our generation's Twain." And soon half of the table was speaking up to be like, "Yeah, no, Terry Pratchett is amazing, and it's really stupid to dismiss him just because he writes what is generally considered a pulp genre and is read relatively widely." Honestly, yeah, Twain was also basically a pop fiction author of his era. And frankly, Twain ain't that deep, bro. Basically, this poor random college kid was eviscerated by half of his friends of equally pretentious college students because he dared to speak trash against Terry Pratchett. And every single time I'm reading a Pratchett book, that memory returns to me. And with it, returns to me the memory that before anyone else spoke up, I was afraid that the first speaker was right, and that I was a bit silly for reading a silly fantasy novel in college. And it's really horrific to ever imagine dismissing Pratchett as a master of satire. But I do think he is dismissed a lot as a master of satire because some people fail to see past the fantasy genre. But more than that, I think a lot of people fail to see past the fact that he writes really good stories. His satire just has a lot more heart than satire traditionally does. When you read Pratchett, you tend to get wrapped up in the story and the characters. You're not thinking so much about who and what is being satirized and what exactly it means, and oh, do I agree with this? Is it funny? You don't spend as much time thinking about the metaphors, the allegories, and the symbols. But personally, I like that. To me, satire and any form of metaphor works best when you're not sitting there analyzing every line, thinking about every implication, and connecting all the dots to the real world. It works best when the author sneaks into your mind and your heart and your soul. Now, that's not to say that Pratchett is subtle. God bless him, he is not subtle. His books are about as subtle as Bugs Bunny dressed as Carmen. But what he did do was write a story that was good enough that the satire is just background. And yeah, I do honestly tend to dislike a lot of satire because it feels soulless. It feels like a caricature, which can be interesting, educational, evocative, and funny. But while a caricature artist often draws several hobbies and interests into a picture, that does nothing to really show us who the person they're drawing actually is. But Pratchett, on the other hand, he makes fun of people, institutions, and societal norms, but he did it in a loving, caring way. He took time to show real people with real souls. Like Brother in this book, he feels like a real person. Now, he has some traits that are extreme and odd, and he thinks in interesting ways, but Pratchett made sure that we could follow his train of thought. We could see his desires. We could understand his struggles. Kitten, really? Under all the silliness of the story, Brother is a man who is seriously struggling with a crisis of faith, being forced to reevaluate the system of morals he has grown up with, and with generally being thrust onto a world stage when he doesn't really have any interest in being on the world stage. Which is one of the main things I want to talk about here. But first, hot cocoa. Pratchett books tend to do something that frankly should not work, and yet always seems to. He wrote stories where characters lack agency, often don't want agency. They don't want to be able to change the world, but pure luck puts them in a position to change everything. It's really noticeable in this particular book, but it appears in a lot of the Discworld books. Characters are either just trying to live normal lives, and their actions of trying to get back to their normal lives backfire spectacularly, and they end up somehow being the hero that changes the world. Or they are desperately trying to change everything, only to have their plans crumble before the throne of story. Like so much of this book, Brother was trying to go back to his normal business, while Ohm, Simony, Ern, Vorbis, and many others are desperately trying to manipulate the god-awful government and culture that they live in, only to fail because history has not put them in the position of hero. In Pratchett, the main character is almost always the one like Brother, who should have little to no effect on the world around him. And that's not the way books are usually written. Not just fantasy books, that's not the way any books are usually written. I think most people naturally identify with the second kind of character, the side characters, the ones desperately trying to change things. I feel like most people at least want to imagine themselves as the kind of people who have great plans and would go on epic quests and would fight tooth and nail for a better world. That's why most books center these characters. But not Pratchett. No, he chooses to center the character who is just trying to go about their normal business, which is ironically who I think most of us actually are. And I think that's one of the many reasons it works really well in Pratchett. But also, he gives these characters unexpected agency through little effort of their own. He puts them in positions where they can, without intending to, make disproportionately large marks on history, often without even realizing what they are doing as they are doing it. This odd lack of desire to be a hero, while the universe basically bends itself backwards to put you in the position of a hero, could feel rather annoying and artificial, because, I mean, most people don't like plots that are driven entirely by luck, and that's what this sort of feels like at times. But for Pratchett, it doesn't annoy me. It doesn't feel artificial. And I think that's because Pratchett wove these plots so incredibly, absurdly tightly. Every side character is following their path as well as they can, and they overlap in all the right ways to just suddenly snap into focus and for everything to work the way it has to. And every single time I read a Pratchett book, one of the main things I walk away with being reminded of is that we cannot actually know which little random choice we make could actually change the world. But there are also a third class of characters in Terry Pratchett books. The people who are actually controlling what's happening. Because in Pratchett books, it's not luck that things work out. They are almost always some small, quiet, barely mentioned character who watch from a distance but occasionally step in to nudge things in the right direction. In this book, it's Lutzi, who is one of the history monks, who exist solely to watch history. And he's a really interesting character in a book that is roundly about people's relationships to God, gods, and belief. Because he is a deus ex machina as a character, even though his actual active moments happen pretty middle range of the book. They're not at the climax, but they become effective and become noticeable why they happened at the climax. The very idea of a character who knows exactly how things are going to happen, and knows exactly what must be done for history to work out, and who has the ability to make small changes and guide people, yeah, in most books, that would be a divine figure. There's also the fact that he has bonsai mountains and his, like, astronomically large age, and yeah, it's hard not to see him as something like a deity. And he's not the only something like a deity that appears in these books. Objectively, there's Death, who is never called a god as far as I can remember in any of the Discworld books, but he's, you know, the personification of the idea of death, which is pretty much what gods often are in fantasy novels, and like any other fantasy world, death would be called a god. There's also weird moments where the god Om wishes that there was someone he could pray to, and then there's that damn turtle, because this turtle is ancient and supposedly or assumingly near ever living, and is carrying the world on its back, and is seemingly disinterested in the workings of man and the people on the disc. And yeah, that feels an awful lot like a god in fantasy as well. So Discworld ends up with these vast layers of godly figures, some of whom are called gods, but the ones who look most like modern religion's conceptions of what divinity are never called gods. Which both is and is not what I would expect from a book that is written by a self-proclaimed humanist/atheist. And I really do love fantasy that explores religion. The joy of religions in fantasy is that you get to explore all these ideas, concepts, and structures without things like logic or belief getting in the way. You can imagine Om as a god who is so disinterested he knows next to nothing about his own religion without that getting trapped up in the trappings of your own personal faith or lack thereof. You don't have to think about, do I believe in God? All you have to think about is, does brother believe in God? And it allows you to explore things that might otherwise be a bit touchy to touch. And I will also say that I think Pratchett did a really great job of painting a religion in the worship of Om that had enough in common with Christianity, Islam, and other world religions that you couldn't escape the knowledge of who he was poking fun at without it being too clearly just one of the real world religions. Which is really good because that means that it avoids drifting into Islamophobia, which I feel like is a much bigger problem now than when this book was written back in 1992. And that brings me to another point that I want to mention. Now, I may be wrong here, considering I was 6 at the time, but I feel like back in 1992, flat earthers were a hell of a lot less of a serious real-world problem than they are now. I mean, this book is basically built along the idea of the church suppressing the truth that the world is really flat. Which is effing hilarious when flat earthers were rare nutjobs who no one listened to, but it's a bit less hilarious when flat earthers have somehow become a serious cult spearheading an anti-science worldview that is doing serious real-world damage. And yeah, in many ways that makes this book a lot more relevant and pertinent to the modern era than when it was actually written. And it's satire that only the dumbest of dumb would miss. But 5 years ago, I would not have thought anyone was dumb enough to think the world is really flat in our world. So, yeah, maybe don't give this book to your batshit anti-science uncle. But for anyone else who has even the slightest ability to read satire, it is more pertinent now than when it was written. There's also this really great take, just in passing in the middle, about the watchmaker theory. There's some beautiful wish fulfillment in an imaginary saving of an imaginary analogous Library of Alexandria, which the internet loves imagining saving the Library of Alexandria, so, you know, that's in there. There's a happy ending, there's character growth, there's some wonderful philosophy that you don't need a degree to understand, and about 100,000 amazing lines. Some of them funny, some of them touching, some of them beautifully deep, and some of them all three at the same time. It's a good book that works its way into your head, making you think about morality, where it stems from, and how we interact with religion, and what it means to live a good life. Overall, Pratchett was an amazing author, and Discworld is an amazing series. Also, hilariously, he's one of those authors that the details of the books never stick in my mind. Like, I cannot hold on to the plots and the summaries of these books. So I can probably read this again in a couple of years and be perfectly surprised by every turn again. Which I sincerely look forward to. One more quick thing. I specifically chose this book to read to be the review that would come out on Christmas. Or Christmas Eve, I should say. Because I wanted this video to be cheerful, happy, pleasant. And Pratchett is one of the few authors in the world that I can be 100% sure I'm going to have positive things to say about. Happy holidays.